A young woman stopped to help her collect the papers, apologizing repeatedly for other people's rudeness. Mrs. Thompson thanked her warmly, but kept her eyes on the man until he disappeared around the corner. Something about him seemed familiar, tugging at her memory. As she carefully reorganized her briefcase, a particular document caught her eye, one from the discrimination case she'd been reviewing. Her heart rate quickened as connections began forming in her mind. The man's face, previously just a source of anger, now clicked into place like the final piece of a jigsaw puzzle. The real estate company she was investigating had a long history of discriminatory practices carefully hidden behind polished corporate policies. She had spent months building a case, gathering testimonies from employees and clients who had experienced prejudice firsthand. And now, ironically, the company's vice president had just provided her with personal evidence of his character. Standing up, Mrs. Thompson smoothed her jacket and straightened her spine. The incident had lasted less than a minute, but its implications would reach far beyond this street corner. While the man had intended to diminish her, he had instead handed her an unexpected gift, a first-hand glimpse into the very behavior her case aimed to expose. She pulled out her phone and made a brief voice note, recording every detail while it was fresh in her mind. The time, the location, his exact words, his appearance, nothing was too small to document. In her line of work, she had learned that victory often lay in the details. Several people who had witnessed the incident still lingered nearby, looking concerned. Mrs. Thompson gave them a reassuring smile, her composure unshaken. Little did they know that behind that smile, her mind was already crafting a strategy that would transform this moment of bigotry into a catalyst for change. As she resumed her walk home, her steps were purposeful, her head held high. The weight of her briefcase seemed lighter now, perhaps because she knew it contained not just documents, but the key to justice. The man who had tried to humiliate her had no idea that he had just strengthened the very case being built against his company. The sun was setting behind the city's skyline, painting the buildings in shades of orange and pink. Mrs. Thompson thought about how many others had faced similar incidents on these very streets, without the means or knowledge to fight back. Her resolve strengthened. This case wasn't just about one company or one incident. It was about changing the very culture that made some people think they could treat others as less than human. Tomorrow, she would begin weaving this encounter into the larger tapestry of her case. But for now, she allowed herself a small smile, knowing that the man's attempt to intimidate her had backfired in ways he couldn't imagine. Sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful response to hatred isn't immediate reaction, but calculated action that creates lasting change. As she turned onto her street, Mrs. Thompson was already planning her next steps. The man who struck her would soon learn a powerful lesson, that underestimating someone based on their race or gender could be the biggest mistake of his career. But that revelation was still to come, and Mrs. Thompson had always been patient when it came to serving justice. The evening air had grown cooler as Mrs. Thompson walked the final blocks to her home, her mind processing the confrontation that had just occurred. Years of courtroom experience had taught her that the moments immediately following an incident were crucial, not just for gathering evidence, but for maintaining the kind of clear-headed thinking that led to effective action. She could still feel the lingering sensation where the man had slammed into her shoulder, but it was the memory of his hateful words that echoed in her thoughts. As she climbed the steps to her front door, she remembered countless similar moments from her 20-year legal career, times when staying composed had proven far more powerful than giving in to anger. Inside her home, she set her briefcase down on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water. The house was quiet, giving her space to think. She pulled out her phone and began making detailed notes about the incident, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen as she documented every aspect while it was fresh in her memory. The expensive cut of his suit, the designer watch on his wrist, the entitled way he had moved through the crowd, these weren't just random details. They painted a picture of someone who was used to power, used to making others feel small. But Mrs. Thompson had spent her career standing up to people exactly like him, and she knew that true power lay in responding strategically, not reactively. As she reviewed her notes, she couldn't help but smile slightly. If he had known who she was, would he have chosen a different target? Would he have thought twice before revealing his true character so blatantly? The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was a man who might have just sabotaged his own company's defense because he couldn't contain his prejudice. Moving to her home office, Mrs. Thompson opened her briefcase and spread out the case files she'd been reviewing earlier. The discrimination lawsuit against Metro Development Corporation was already substantial, with testimonies from former employees and documented instances of biased hiring practices. But personal testimony from someone who had experienced the vice president's racism firsthand? That could be game-changing. She began drafting a detailed account of the incident, her legal training guiding her to focus on objective facts rather than emotional responses. The time, the location, the exact words used, everything was recorded with professional precision. She noted the names of several businesses near the incident, knowing their security cameras might have captured the encounter. The phone rang, interrupting her work. It was her colleague from the law firm, calling about an unrelated case. As they talked, Mrs. Thompson found herself thinking about how different her response might have been in her earlier years of practice. Back then, she might have reacted emotionally, might have shouted back or called the police. But experience had taught her that the most effective response to prejudice often came through the system she knew best, the law. After finishing the call, she returned to her documentation. The sun had set completely now, and the soft lamp light cast a warm glow over her desk. She thought about the young woman who had stopped to help her pick up her papers. How many people witnessed such incidents every day and felt powerless to respond? This case wasn't just about one company or one man, it was about setting precedents that would protect others. Mrs. Thompson made herself a cup of tea and settled deeper into her work. She pulled up the company's personnel files that had been submitted during discovery. There he was, Richard Wilson, Vice President of Operations at Metro Development. The photo confirmed what she already knew. The man who had attacked her was a high-ranking executive in the very company she was investigating. She thought about how tomorrow would unfold. She would need to inform her legal team, document everything properly, and decide the best way to incorporate this new evidence into their existing case. The incident would need to be handled carefully, not as a personal vendetta, but as another piece in the larger puzzle of systematic discrimination they were working to expose. As she worked, Mrs. Thompson reflected on the countless clients who had sat in her office over the years, sharing their stories of discrimination. Many had faced similar moments of blatant prejudice, but few had been in a position to do anything about it. She had the tools, the knowledge, and now the personal experience to fight back effectively. Looking at the time, she realized she had been working for several hours straight. The initial shock of the incident had completely transformed into purposeful action. She gathered her notes together, already planning the steps she would take in the morning. There would be meetings to schedule, affidavits to prepare, and strategies to revise. Before heading to bed, she stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Richard Wilson was probably going about his evening without a second thought about what he had done. He had no idea that his impulsive act of hatred would soon become a crucial piece of evidence in a case that could reshape his company's entire culture. Mrs. Thompson thought about how personal encounters like these often became turning points in larger battles for justice. Throughout history, significant legal changes had often stemmed from seemingly small moments of confrontation. Her response to this incident could help create ripples of change that would affect countless others. As she prepared for bed, she felt a sense of calm purpose. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she was ready for them. Her years of experience had taught her that the most powerful response to hatred wasn't matching it with more hatred, but transforming it into positive change through careful, strategic action. She set her alarm for early morning, knowing there was much work to be done. The man who had struck her on that sidewalk had intended to make her feel powerless. Instead, he had given her exactly what she needed to strengthen her fight for justice. Sometimes, she thought as she drifted off to sleep, the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was using the law to ensure that such behavior carried real consequences. The next day would bring its own challenges, but Mrs. Thompson was ready. She had learned long ago that true strength wasn't about immediate reaction, but about thoughtful response. And her response to this incident would leave lasting impacts far beyond that brief sidewalk encounter. The early morning light filtered through the windows of Mrs. Thompson's law office as she spread out her case files across the polished mahogany desk. Her eyes kept returning to the photo in the company profile, Richard Wilson, the man from yesterday's encounter. The more she studied his face, the more pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. She remembered first seeing this photo months ago when the discrimination case landed on her desk. Back then, he had just been another executive's face in a corporate directory. Now, after experiencing his prejudice firsthand, she understood why so many employees had been hesitant to speak up against him. Taking a sip of her morning coffee, she opened her laptop and began reviewing the testimonies they'd gathered. Stories of passed-over promotions, hostile work environments, and subtle threats painted a clear pattern. Her own experience on that sidewalk wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a much larger picture of systematic discrimination. A knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Her legal assistant entered with a stack of new documents from Metro Development Corporation. "These just came in from their legal team," he said, placing them on her desk. "They're still claiming all discrimination allegations are unfounded." Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but smile slightly. Unfounded was an interesting choice of words, considering what had happened yesterday. She thanked her assistant and began examining the new papers, but trained eye-catching details that others might miss. The company's carefully worded denials now seemed even more hollow. As she worked through the morning, more connections emerged. The incident report she'd written about yesterday's encounter matched perfectly with complaints from former employees. The same arrogance, the same sense of superiority, the same casual cruelty, it was all there in black and white. Around noon, she received a call from one of her key witnesses, a former Metro Development employee who had been unfairly terminated. The woman's voice trembled slightly as she described her experiences with Richard Wilson. "He always acted so professional in meetings," she explained, "but when no one important was watching." Mrs. Thompson listened intently, jotting down notes. The parallel between her sidewalk encounter and this woman's story was striking. Wilson clearly felt comfortable showing his true colors when he thought there would be no consequences. After the call, she pulled up the security camera footage her team had managed to obtain from businesses near yesterday's incident. The grainy video clearly showed the collision, though it couldn't capture the slur he had whispered. Still, his body language told the story: the deliberate angle of his approach, the aggressive posture, the contemptuous glance back. She spent the afternoon carefully documenting how this new evidence connected to their existing case. Each point had to be presented precisely, showing how Wilson's public behavior reflected the company's hidden culture of discrimination. Her own encounter would serve as a powerful illustration of how deeply rooted these attitudes were. As the day progressed, Mrs. Thompson received calls from several other attorneys working on similar cases. Word had gotten around about her encounter with Wilson, and they were eager to share information. One lawyer had been building a separate case against Metro Development in another state, with surprisingly similar allegations. The sun was setting when she finally leaned back in her chair, surrounded by papers and notes. On her computer screen, she had compiled a timeline of events, with yesterday's incident fitting perfectly into the pattern they'd been tracking. It was almost as if Wilson had handed her the missing piece of a complex puzzle. She thought about how different this case would have been without that sidewalk encounter. While they had plenty of evidence before, there was something powerful about being able to testify firsthand about the company's vice president's behavior. It would be much harder for their legal team to dismiss dozens of similar complaints when one of them came from an opposing counsel. Before leaving the office, Mrs. Thompson made one final call to her investigative team. She wanted them to dig deeper into Wilson's history, suspecting that yesterday's incident wasn't the first time he had shown his true nature in public. People who displayed such open prejudice rarely did so just once. As she packed up her briefcase, she noticed a new email from Metro Development's legal department. They were requesting a meeting to discuss recent developments in the case. She wondered if they had somehow heard about the incident or if this was just routine legal maneuvering. The drive home gave her time to reflect on how quickly things had changed. Just 2 days ago, this had been a strong but standard discrimination case. Now it had become something more personal, more immediate. Yet she felt no anger towards Wilson, only a calm determination to use this experience to create real change. That evening, as she reviewed her notes one final time, Mrs. Thompson thought about all the people who had faced similar treatment but lacked the legal knowledge to fight back. Her encounter with Wilson hadn't just strengthened their case, It had reinforced why this work was so important. She closed her files for the night, knowing tomorrow would bring new challenges. But she was ready for them. Sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful moments in a case came from unexpected places. Wilson had tried to intimidate her on that sidewalk, never realizing he was giving her exactly what she needed to expose the truth about his company's culture. As she prepared for bed, Mrs. Thompson felt a quiet sense of purpose. The case had transformed from a professional obligation into something more meaningful, a chance to show that no one, no matter their position or power, was above the law. And in the end, that was what justice was all about. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mrs. Thompson's office as she organized her strategy for responding to the sidewalk incident. Her desk was covered with case files, witness statements, and her own detailed notes from that encounter. Instead of rushing to file a personal complaint, she was carefully weaving this incident into the larger discrimination case against Metro Development. Her phone buzzed with a message from her investigative team. They had located 3 more security cameras that might have captured the encounter from different angles. More importantly, they had uncovered similar complaints about Richard Wilson from former business associates, people outside the company who had experienced his prejudice firsthand. "This is exactly what we needed," she murmured, adding the new information to her growing file. The pattern was becoming clearer with each passing day. Wilson's behavior on the sidewalk wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a consistent pattern that extended far beyond Metro Development's walls. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her colleague from the Civil Rights Division entered, carrying a thick folder. "You need to see this," he said, placing it on her desk. 3 more former employees came forward after hearing about your encounter with Wilson. They've been too afraid to speak up until now. Mrs. Thompson spent the next hour reading their statements, each one reinforcing what she already knew. Wilson's sidewalk behavior wasn't just a moment of lost temper, it was his true character showing through the corporate facade. These new testimonies described similar encounters, similar slurs, similar attempts to intimidate. By midday, she had drafted a comprehensive strategy for incorporating all this new evidence into their case. The sidewalk incident would serve as a pivotal example, demonstrating how the company's discriminatory culture extended beyond workplace walls. Her personal experience would help validate dozens of similar complaints that the company had previously dismissed. She took a break for lunch, sitting by her office window and watching the busy street below. Somewhere out there, Wilson was probably going about his day, unaware that his impulsive act of hatred was about to become a crucial piece of evidence against him and his company. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with her legal team. They carefully reviewed each aspect of the case, making sure every connection was properly documented. Mrs. Thompson shared her detailed account of the sidewalk incident, and they discussed how to present it most effectively in court. "What makes this different," she explained to her colleagues, "is that we can now show how their corporate culture affects not just employees, but anyone who crosses paths with their executives. This isn't just workplace discrimination, it's a deeper pattern of behavior." As they worked, more information kept arriving. The security footage from nearby businesses had been enhanced, clearly showing Wilson's aggressive approach and the deliberate collision. While the audio couldn't capture his whispered slur, his body language told the story clearly enough. Late in the afternoon, Mrs. Thompson received an unexpected call. A former board member of Metro Development wanted to speak with her confidentially. He had heard about the sidewalk incident and had his own stories to share about Wilson's behavior during private board meetings. "I should have spoken up sooner," the former board member admitted. "But I was worried about the professional consequences. After hearing what happened to you, I realized I can't stay silent anymore." This was the kind of breakthrough that could transform a strong case into an airtight one. Mrs. Thompson spent an hour talking with him, carefully documenting every detail he shared. His insider perspective would be invaluable in showing how deep the problems ran at Metro Development. As evening approached, she began preparing for the next day's deposition of a key witness. Her encounter with Wilson had changed the dynamics of these interviews. Now, when witnesses described their experiences with discrimination, she could relate to their stories in a more personal way. Before leaving the office, she reviewed the latest draft of their legal strategy. The sidewalk incident had been carefully woven throughout the document, serving as a concrete example of how Metro Development's toxic culture manifested in the real world. What Wilson had intended as an act of intimidation had instead become powerful evidence against him. Driving home, Mrs. Thompson reflected on how different this case felt now. It had always been important, but now it carried additional weight. She wasn't just fighting for her clients anymore. She was fighting to ensure that no one else would have to experience what she and so many others had endured. At home, she spent some time in her garden, letting the peaceful environment help her process the day's developments. The case was growing stronger by the hour, but she knew the real challenge lay ahead. They would face fierce opposition from Metro Development's legal team, and Wilson would likely try to deny or minimize his actions. But Mrs. Thompson was ready for the fight. She had spent her career preparing for moments like this, building cases that created real change. Wilson's sidewalk attack had given her more than just evidence. It had given her a deeper understanding of what her clients had experienced. As she prepared for bed, she reviewed her schedule for the next day. More witnesses to interview, more evidence to compile, more strategies to refine. But now everything felt more focused, more purposeful. What had started as a routine discrimination case had evolved into something that could set important legal precedents. She fell asleep thinking about all the people who had faced similar treatment but lacked the means to fight back. Tomorrow, she would continue building a case that would speak for all of them. Wilson's attempt to intimidate her had backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing another voice, he had amplified dozens of them. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as Mrs. Thompson arranged her documents at the prosecution table. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Today was the day they would present the newly strengthened case against Metro Development Corporation, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. She caught sight of Richard Wilson sitting with his legal team, his expression a mixture of confidence and barely concealed disdain. He hadn't recognized her yet, hadn't connected the opposing counsel with the woman he'd confronted on the sidewalk. That revelation would come soon enough. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose in unison. As everyone settled back into their seats, Mrs. Thompson noticed more people than usual in the gallery. Word had spread about this hearing, drawing civil rights activists, journalists, and other attorneys interested in similar cases. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, "we've amended our filing with new evidence that demonstrates a pattern of discrimination extending beyond workplace boundaries." She could feel Wilson's eyes on her as she spoke, searching her face. The moment of recognition hadn't come yet. The first witness was a former Metro Development employee who had worked directly under Wilson. Her testimony was compelling, describing years of subtle discrimination and passed-over promotions. Mrs. Thompson guided her gently through the questioning, building a foundation for what was to come. By mid-morning, they had presented testimony from 3 more witnesses, each adding another layer to their case. The judge listened intently, occasionally making notes. Wilson's legal team tried to discredit each witness, but the pattern was becoming undeniable. During the lunch recess, Mrs. Thompson overheard Wilson talking to his lawyers in the hallway. "These people are just disgruntled ex-employees," he was saying. "They're making up stories because they couldn't cut it in our company." His voice carried the same arrogant tone she remembered from the sidewalk. When court resumed, Mrs. Thompson called the former board member who had recently come forward. His testimony was devastating, detailed accounts of discriminatory decisions made in closed-door meetings, with Wilson often leading the charge. The defense team's objections grew more frequent and desperate. As the afternoon progressed, Mrs. Thompson methodically presented security camera footage from various incidents, including the sidewalk encounter. She watched Wilson's face as the video played, saw the moment he finally recognized her. His expression shifted from confusion to shock to barely controlled anger. "Your Honor," she continued, maintaining her professional composure, "this footage shows Mr. Wilson, unprovoked, physically assaulting a person on a public sidewalk while using racial slurs." She paused, letting the impact of her words sink in. "That person was me." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Wilson's attorneys huddled together, whispering urgently. The judge called for order, his gavel echoing through the suddenly silent room. Wilson's face had turned a deep shade of red. Mrs. Thompson proceeded to detail the incident, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. She described how this personal encounter connected to the larger pattern of discrimination they had demonstrated throughout the day. The judge listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about one incident on a sidewalk," she explained. "It's about a corporate culture that encourages and protects this kind of behavior." Mr. Wilson felt comfortable showing his true nature because he believed there would be no consequences. The defense team tried to paint the sidewalk incident as a simple misunderstanding, but their arguments felt hollow against the weight of evidence. Wilson himself seemed to shrink in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by growing concern. As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson presented their final piece of evidence, a comprehensive analysis showing how incidents like these connected to Metro Development's hiring practices, promotion patterns, and corporate policies. The picture it painted was damning. The judge announced they would reconvene the following morning for closing arguments. As people filed out of the courtroom, Mrs. Thompson caught Wilson staring at her, his expression unreadable. She met his gaze calmly, then turned to pack up her materials. That evening in her office, she reviewed her notes for the next day's closing argument. The case had evolved into something larger than she'd initially imagined. It wasn't just about workplace discrimination anymore. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, both inside and outside corporate walls. Her phone buzzed with messages from other attorneys, congratulating her on the day's proceedings. The case was already being discussed in legal circles as a potential landmark decision. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't thinking about making legal history. She was focused on ensuring justice was served. Before leaving for the night, she stood at her office window, watching the city lights come on. Somewhere out there, other people were facing similar discrimination, feeling powerless to fight back. Tomorrow's closing argument would be for them as much as for her clients. She thought about how different things might have been if Wilson had simply walked past her that day, keeping his prejudice hidden. Instead, his moment of hatred had helped expose years of systematic discrimination. Sometimes, she reflected, justice came from unexpected places. As she drove home, Mrs. Thompson felt a deep sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she was ready. The case had become more than a legal battle. It was a chance to show that no one was above the law, no matter their position or power. She spent the evening preparing for the next day, knowing that her closing argument needed to be perfect. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore, it was about creating lasting change. Wilson's sidewalk attack had given her the opportunity to do exactly that. The morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as Mrs. Thompson prepared for what would be one of the most significant moments of her career. She was about to cross-examine Richard Wilson, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Wilson sat in the witness chair, projecting an air of corporate confidence. His expensive suit and carefully practiced demeanor couldn't completely hide his unease as Mrs. Thompson approached the podium. The entire courtroom fell silent, aware they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Mr. Wilson," she began, her voice calm and measured, "could you please state your position at Metro Development Corporation?" She watched as he straightened his tie, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "I'm the Vice President of Operations," he responded, his voice carrying a hint of the arrogance she remembered from their sidewalk encounter. Mrs. Thompson nodded, shuffling through her papers with deliberate slowness. "And in that role, you're responsible for overseeing hiring and promotion decisions, correct?" Her questioning started simple, laying the groundwork. Wilson agreed, seemingly relieved by the basic nature of the questions. But Mrs. Thompson was just warming up. With methodical precision, she began walking him through the company's history of discrimination complaints. Each question was carefully crafted, drawing from the mountain of evidence they'd gathered. "Can you explain why qualified candidates of color were consistently passed over for promotions in your department?" She watched as Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His answers became increasingly defensive, filled with corporate jargon about best qualified candidates and merit-based decisions. The tension in the courtroom grew as Mrs. Thompson moved closer to the heart of the matter. She presented document after document, each one challenging Wilson's carefully constructed narrative. His confident facade began to crack under the weight of the evidence. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. "Mr. Wilson, do you recall your actions on the afternoon of November 15th?" The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. He glanced at his attorneys, who looked equally concerned. "I have many meetings and interactions each day," he replied evasively. "You'll need to be more specific." Mrs. Thompson smiled slightly, then played the security camera footage on the courtroom's display screens. The footage showed their sidewalk encounter from multiple angles. While the audio couldn't capture his whispered slur, his aggressive body language was clear for everyone to see. Wilson's face reddened as he watched himself deliberately collide with Mrs. Thompson. "Would you like to explain your actions in this video, Mr. Wilson?" Her voice remained professional, but there was an undeniable force behind her words. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Wilson stumbled through various explanations. He was in a hurry, the sidewalk was crowded, it was all a misunderstanding. But Mrs. Thompson systematically dismantled each excuse, connecting his behavior to the larger pattern of discrimination they'd uncovered. "Is it your normal practice to physically intimidate people on public sidewalks?" she asked, her question hanging in the air. Wilson's attempt at a response was weak and unconvincing. As the cross-examination continued, Mrs. Thompson masterfully connected Wilson's personal behavior to Metro Development's corporate culture. Each question revealed another layer of systematic discrimination, another example of how prejudice had been normalized within the company. The judge leaned forward, clearly engaged by the proceedings. Even Wilson's own attorneys looked increasingly uncomfortable as their client's testimony unraveled under Mrs. Thompson's questioning. "Mr. Wilson," she said, approaching her conclusion, "would you say your actions that day reflected the values of Metro Development Corporation?" It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. If he said yes, he'd admit to corporate discrimination. If he said no, he'd have to explain why a vice president acted so contrary to company values. His response was a mumbled combination of corporate speak and weak denials. Mrs. Thompson let his words hang in the air for a moment before delivering her final questions, each one highlighting the disconnect between the company's stated policies and its actual practices. As she returned to her seat, the impact of the cross-examination was evident throughout the courtroom. What had started as a discrimination case had become something more, a detailed exposure of how prejudice could infect every level of a corporate structure. The defense team tried to recover during redirect examination, but the damage was done. Wilson's credibility had been systematically demolished, not through aggressive questioning, but through careful exposure of the truth. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson gathered her materials, aware that they'd just witnessed a turning point in the case. Wilson's testimony, combined with the mountain of evidence they'd presented, had created an undeniable picture of systematic discrimination. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager for comments about the day's proceedings. But Mrs. Thompson simply smiled and walked to her car, knowing the real statement had been made in the courtroom. That evening, as she reviewed her notes from the day, she thought about all the people who had suffered under Wilson's leadership. His sidewalk attack on her had been just one example of a much larger problem. But now, finally, there would be consequences. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, but the hard work had been done. Through careful preparation and strategic questioning, they had exposed the truth about Metro Development's discriminatory practices. Justice, she reflected, often came down to asking the right questions and having the courage to pursue the answers, no matter where they led. The courtroom was packed on the final day of the trial, with every seat filled and people standing along the walls. The morning light cast a solemn glow as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict in the landmark discrimination case against Metro Development Corporation. Mrs. Thompson sat at the prosecution table, her posture straight but relaxed. Months of preparation, countless hours of testimony, and that fateful sidewalk encounter had all led to this moment. Across the aisle, Richard Wilson and his legal team looked tense, their earlier confidence completely eroded. The judge cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, he began, his voice firm and clear, "This court finds Metro Development Corporation guilty of systematic discrimination in their hiring and promotion practices." The gallery erupted in hushed whispers as the judge continued outlining the verdict. The settlement was unprecedented, not just in its monetary value, but in the sweeping changes it mandated for the company's practices. Furthermore, the judge announced, The court orders the immediate establishment of a comprehensive diversity training program to be overseen by an independent committee. His eyes swept across the courtroom, lingering briefly on Wilson. The evidence of discriminatory behavior extending beyond workplace boundaries makes these measures particularly necessary. The settlement included substantial compensation for affected employees, but more importantly, it required Metro Development to completely overhaul its hiring and promotion practices. Regular audits would ensure compliance, and any executive found engaging in discriminatory behavior would face immediate consequences. Wilson sat stone-faced as the judge detailed his personal responsibilities. As a condition of maintaining his position, he would be required to complete extensive sensitivity training and participate in community outreach programs. His sidewalk attack on Mrs. Thompson had become a pivotal example in the judge's decision. After the verdict was read, people began filing out of the courtroom. Former employees hugged each other, some wiping away tears of relief. Mrs. Thompson remained seated, taking a moment to absorb the significance of what they'd accomplished. One of her key witnesses, a former Metro Development employee, approached her desk. "Thank you," she said quietly. "We never thought anyone would believe us until you came along." Her words captured the essence of why this case had been so important. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to cover what was already being called a landmark decision. Mrs. Thompson offered brief comments, focusing on the broader implications rather than personal victory. "This case wasn't just about one company," she explained. "It's about setting standards for corporate behavior both inside and outside office walls." Later that afternoon, in her office, Mrs. Thompson received calls from civil rights attorneys across the country. The verdict had set important precedents for holding corporations accountable for discriminatory practices. Her experience had become a powerful example of how personal encounters could lead to institutional change. She spent time calling each witness who had testified, thanking them for their courage. Many shared stories of relief, knowing that their experiences had finally been validated. The verdict hadn't just changed Metro Development, it had given hope to others facing similar situations. As evening approached, Mrs. Thompson stood by her office window, watching the city below. She thought about that sidewalk encounter that had started it all. Wilson had intended to intimidate her, to make her feel powerless. Instead, he had provided the catalyst for meaningful change. The next few weeks would be busy with implementing the settlement terms. Independent auditors would begin reviewing Metro Development's practices, and the mandated training programs would need to be established. But the hardest part, proving systematic discrimination, was done. At home that evening, Mrs. Thompson received an unexpected email from a young law student who had attended the trial. The student described how watching the proceedings had inspired her to pursue civil rights law. "You showed us that one person really can make a difference," she wrote. Mrs. Thompson smiled, remembering her own early days in law school. She hadn't set out to become a champion for workplace equality. Circumstances and conscience had led her there. Sometimes the most important battles found you, rather than the other way around. Before going to bed, she reviewed the judge's written decision one more time. The language was clear and forceful, setting precedents that would help others fight similar battles. Wilson's sidewalk attack, intended as an act of intimidation, had instead become a crucial piece of evidence that helped expose years of corporate discrimination. The next morning's newspapers carried headlines about the verdict. Civil rights organizations praised the decision's broad implications, while business publications focused on its impact on corporate culture. The case had struck a chord, highlighting issues that went far beyond one company's practices. Mrs. Thompson knew this wasn't the end. There would be more cases, more battles to fight. But today's victory would make those future fights a little easier. Sometimes justice came from unexpected places, turning moments of prejudice into catalysts for positive change. As she prepared for another day at work, she thought about all the people who had helped make this victory possible. The witnesses who came forward, the investigators who gathered evidence, and even Wilson himself, whose actions had unintentionally exposed the truth about his company's culture. The case had transformed from a personal encounter into something much larger, a testament to the power of standing up against discrimination, no matter how powerful the opponent. In the end, justice had prevailed not through confrontation, but through careful application of the law and unwavering pursuit of the truth.